The most powerful man in the world dies at 33 years old. His death, following a brief and violent illness, could lead many to question whether that death was from disease or murder. He came through power through the assassination of his father, an assassination that many believe he was behind. I'm Mick Biddick, and you're listening to History is Criminal. In this, our very first episode, we'll examine the life and untimely death of one of the most powerful leaders to ever live. Alexander the Great ruled from Macedonia to the Greek peninsula, throughout the Persian Empire, and even was named the God King Pharaoh of Egypt. In just 13 years, he took over a kingdom from his father, conquered the formidable Persian Empire, and expanded his rule all the way to the Indian subcontinent. Alexander III was born July 356 BCE in the capital of Macedonia, Pella. His education would be in the traditional Greek style, with a focus on mind and body. His tutors, however, were far from typical. The bulk of his education would be the responsibility of three men: the philosopher Aristotle, whom Alexander would have a lifelong correspondence with. Aristotle would pass on to Alexander a tremendous love of learning. Leonidas, a relative of his mother, named after the famous Greek Spartan king, who was primarily responsible for Alexander's physical and military training. His third tutor, Lysimachus, would introduce Alexander to the writings of Homer. Writings of Homer would have a huge impact on Alexander as he became obsessed with the tales of the Iliad and Odyssey and saw himself as an Achilles-type figure. Now, you can almost imagine, a little Alexander running around with his wooden sword, reenacting the battles he had read about in the Iliad and Odyssey. But in fact, in his family, warfare was a serious family business. Alexander's father, Philip II of Macedonia, like many kings of the ancient world, had very little to do with raising his children. Often away quelling rebellions or expanding the control of his reach over the Greek city-states, he would also take several wives, a common practice among Greek and Macedonian rulers. And while these marriages did build alliances, it would also leave the question of succession a little murky. Alexander and his mother, Olympias, who was by all accounts an ambitious, smart woman who wanted to maintain her and her children's rightful place in the order of succession. To say he was closer to his mother would be an understatement. This is not to say that his father completely ignored Alexander. In fact, his father clearly had great plans and great faith in his son. So much so that Philip, while he was away at the siege of Byzantium, named Alexander as regent at the age of 16. Now, at 16, my father could barely trust me to hold the flashlight in the right spot when he was working on something. But Philip not only trusted Alexander with the keys to the kingdom, but an army to protect it. Alexander proved to be more than just a figurehead. In his short time as regent, he led a military campaign against the rebelling city-state of Thrace. Upon defeating Thrace, he would then found the city of Alexandropolis, the first of many cities to bear his name. So you can see even here at 16, Alexander, little full of himself, naming a city after himself. And he does all this before his 17th birthday. His father, maybe seeing Alexander's gift for battle, or maybe in a move to help prepare him to be king himself one day, would appoint Alexander to lead one of his armies. It was at about this time that Philip would marry his seventh wife, Cleopatra, who oddly shared a name with Alexander's sister. Cleopatra, the seventh wife, was from a Macedonian noble family. Olympias, Alexander's mother, was from Greek nobility. So this marriage to Cleopatra may have been arranged to give Philip a fully Macedonian heir. This would have helped keep Macedonian nobles happy. Philip had issues with the occasional Macedonian uprising. By marrying into one of the more powerful Macedonian noble families, Philip would strengthen his position among the Macedonian neighbors. However, this might have caused a little rift between Philip and Olympias. I don't know, what issues were caused by the other 5 wives, but this one was going to be a real problem for Olympias. Both Alexander and Olympias had been removed from court. Olympias and Alexander both become very worried about the possibility of Alexander being cut out of the line of succession. However, even the complications of Macedonian marriage laws could not stop life from moving forward. And in this case, that meant another marriage. This time, it would be Alexander's sister, the other Cleopatra, who would walk down the aisle. Philip had arranged the marriage of his daughter to Olympias' brother, Alexander of Epirus. Sorry that everyone seems to have the same names here, but it was 330 BCE, and, well, they apparently hadn't thought of a lot of names yet. Believe it or not, this marriage between an uncle and his niece was a political move on the part of Philip to smooth the rift that had developed between himself and Olympias' family over the taking of wife number 7. Leading up to this marriage, Philip used a combination of military might, diplomacy, and marriage to expand the Macedonian control of the Greek city-states to the south. The League of Corinth, founded by Philip in 338 BCE, was on the surface a union of Greek and Macedonian forces to keep the Persians at bay. However, in reality, Philip had placed himself at the head of the League in a move to not only solidify his power over the Greeks, but in hopes of expanding into Persia. Just before the marriage of his daughter to her uncle, Philip made his move on Persia. While it is unclear just what Philip's goals were in Persia, did he want to grab territory? Did he want to send a message to the Persians? Or was he bent on conquest? In the end, it wouldn't matter because Philip wasn't going to be around long enough to see any of his goals through. During the wedding procession of Cleopatra to Alexander of Epirus, Philip was assassinated by one of his own guards. During the procession, Pausanias, one of Philip's 7 bodyguards, stepped forward and stabbed him through the ribcage. Historical sources tell us that Pausanias almost made a clean getaway. However, in his mad dash to the exit and his awaiting comrades, he tripped. He was then quickly killed by Philip's remaining bodyguards, 3 of whom were close associates of Alexander. Now, because Pausanias was killed so quickly, no motive was given for the assassination. Why he assassinated Philip still remains a mystery. But there are several theories. All of these are based solely on conjecture. One involved a love triangle. Now, sexuality among the Macedonians and Greeks was, to say the least, fluid. It was very common for people to have lovers of both genders. I don't know what's going on with Philip here. 7 wives, multiple lovers of different genders. I have no idea how he was able to find the time to conquer Greece or to do anything else. But that seems to be what Philip was into. Now, I'm not throwing stones. Let your freak flag fly, Philip. But one theory goes that Philip had perhaps rejected Pausanias or possibly taken another lover, angering Pausanias. A second story, preferred by many other scholars, is that Pausanias had suffered an insult that Philip had refused to allow him to revenge. And while we may never know the reason for his assassination, there is one more intriguing theory, and that is that Alexander and his mother had Philip killed before a new heir could be named. The most obvious support for this theory is that Alexander had the most to gain from the death of his father. But other details also support this case of regicide becoming a case of parricide. The evidence against Alexander's mother is circumstantial at best, but a compelling case can be made. First, Alexander had Pausanias killed quickly and without trial. While this could just be the circumstances, after all, he had just killed the king in a very public way. You can imagine the king's remaining bodyguards very angered at seeing the king assassinated on their watch, and they might have a tendency to want to put an end to the would be assassin very quickly. Now, the manner in which Panacea was captured is almost comical. He stabs the king through the ribs, then takes off running towards an exit and trips over a root. He is very quickly set upon and killed. What's interesting here is that 3 of Alexander's lifelong friends were the people who killed Panacea. All 3 of these would see their fortunes greatly increase under Alexander's rule. Whether Alexander or his mother, or both, had a hand in the assassination of Philip is unknown. But what is clear is that Alexander wasted no time in taking advantage of the situation. He took moves to quickly eliminate any opposition to his ascension to the throne, getting rid of the disloyal, including Attalus, the uncle of Philip's 7th wife and one of Philip's generals. Also finding a quick death on the orders of Alexander was his cousin, Amindus. His crime was having made a previous claim to the throne himself. Then, taking charge of his father's armies, Alexander would squash would-be rebellions in both Macedonia and Greece before turning his attention to an empire that had proven a thorn in everyone's side, Persia. While it is tempting to go into great detail on Alexander's violent and meteoric push across the Persian Empire, that would take days, and we really want to get back to the next possible assassination. But it is important to note that Alexander was not just a shockingly good battlefield commander, he also knew how to use realpolitik and understood how image and propaganda could make taking and maintaining territory easier. While historians often question Philip's goals in Persia, Alexander's were clear: conquer and maintain control of all he could reach. Persians were no shrinking violets. This was an empire that had dominated Southwest Asia, spread into North Africa. Alexander's father and grandfather had both faced defeats at the hand of the Persians. This may have, in fact, been part of what drove Alexander. His sweep through the Persian Empire was nothing short of legendary. In battle, his forces seemed unstoppable. In military planning, Alexander was a pure genius. But what often gets left out is Alexander's use of image or 330 BCE propaganda. 3 stories stand out here. First being the Gordian knot. According to legend, King Gordas of Phrygia had a complicated knot constructed, so jumbled that it couldn't be untied. Now, having worked in an elementary school with small children, you can imagine, something pretty much akin to what they do to their shoelaces on a daily basis. Anyway, the legend stated that whoever untied the knot would become the ruler of Asia. When Alexander came to the knot, he studied it very closely. Then he pulled out his sword and began hacking away at the knot. Now, of course, the knot would give way. Logically, we could say that Alexander cheated. But first, I don't know if the knot had a rule book. And second, this guy, having crushed the supposed unbeatable armies of the great Persian Empire, so really, who's going to call him on this? Point is, Alexander can now claim that prophecy said he'd rule Asia. And as I said, with an army backing him, who's really going to question? The second example of Alexander knowing the world of politics, not just warfare, comes to us as he makes his way into Egypt. Egypt had long resented the foreign rule of Persia, and they would be unlikely to see a 23-year-old Macedonian as much of an improvement. This could well explain Alexander's actions in Egypt. With Darius, the great king of Persia, on the run, Alexander turns to Egypt. Upon his arrival, not only does he make a great showing of offerings of sacrifice to Greek gods and goddesses, but he also sacrifices to various Egyptian deities. This show of respect for Egyptian ways, and again the presence of Alexander's victorious army, led the priest at Memphis, the capital of Egypt, to crown him pharaoh in 332 BCE. At the age of 24, he now ruled from Macedonia to Egypt. He not only was smart enough to allow the Egyptians to keep their religion and culture, but he himself seems to have embraced it. In addition, he appointed Egyptians to positions of power. He would, however, make sure that the Egyptian military forces remained loyal to him and him alone. It was this embracing of Egyptian and Eastern cultures that might have eased his control over his new territories. Alexander, it is said, even began to dress in Egyptian and Eastern fashions. However, be clear, he was also spreading Hellenistic culture as he marched east. This last idea, his embracing of foreign ways, may have turned out to be a deadly double-edged sword for Alexander. In 330 BC, Darius III, the great king of Persia, was himself assassinated. Failing to defeat the onslaught of Alexander's forces, it seems the Persians had lost faith in their great king. He was deposed and killed. Shortly after, Alexander was able to lay claim to the title Great King of Persia. Alexander, now 26 years old, launched a new campaign that would take him across modern-day Iran and into India. How far Alexander was willing to go is unknown. After all, he was only 33 years old when it all came to an end. He had defeated the great enemies of Greece and Macedonia. He was a god king in Egypt, a title that may have gone to his head. But let's be honest, if people said you were a living god, you might get a little full of yourself too. He had successfully faced down uprisings and rebellions, and even lived through a wound to his neck that really should have killed him. Then on June 10th, 323 BCE, Alexander died after a brief but violent illness. Philip's death had left no question that it was an assassination. The only question was why, and that question was left unanswered. With Alexander's death, there were nothing but questions. The official story was that he had died of malaria or possibly typhoid fever. But conspiracies, as they will, spread as fast as the news broke. It is important to remember that this is 323 BCE, and the guys from CSI aren't going to show up and take tissue samples. In fact, best as I can tell, it seems they did a little more than poke him with a stick to see if he was still alive. You just imagine standing there poking him. Well, he ain't moved. Guess he's dead. The reason I say this is because one theory that has been proposed is that Alexander actually was not dead, but was in a deep coma brought on by a lung infection. Now, this is partially supported because eyewitnesses claim that Alexander's body had not gone into the early stages of decomposition. That would be a horrible way to go. Death by embalming. Ugh. But when the most powerful person in the world dies from a sudden and violent illness, people will naturally think murder. And with Alexander's death, there is as much evidence to support assassination as there is to support disease. Our only surviving description of Alexander's death comes from Diodorus Silezius and was recorded nearly 200 years after Alexander's death. He cites sources saying Alexander had been, quote, stricken with pain after drinking a large bowl of wine, unquote. This points to the possibility of poisoning. Arsenic was the first poison that people pointed to as a weapon. However, more recently, people have pointed to the use of white hellebore, aka Veratrum album. A Dr. Leo Shep of the New Zealand Poison Center has said that wine mixed with white hellebore would produce symptoms very similar to those reported in the historical sources. So if Alexander was assassinated, who would have cause? His stepmother, Cleopatra, would be an obvious choice, having the motive that with Alexander out of the way, her son Philip III would have a claim to the throne. But opportunity would be hard to come by for Cleopatra, as Alexander had not returned to Macedonia since he first left to go on a march to Persia, and she would not have readily had availability to get to him. Of course, she could have paid somebody in Alexander's inner circle to do the deed. After Alexander's death, Cleopatra and her family would make a push to put young Philip III on the throne, and he would actually come to the throne briefly before himself being removed. Yet there's another suspect who had motive, means, and opportunity, and that is Ptolemy Soter. Now, we don't want to confuse this Ptolemy with the mathematician. This Ptolemy was Alexander's general and lifelong friend. So why would someone so close to Alexander assassinate him? Well, Ptolemy, it would turn out, became the ruler of Egypt after Alexander's death. So there are literally millions of reasons why Ptolemy might want to see Alexander gone. Second, many had grown tired of Alexander's embracing of all things Oriental and his desire to be seen as a living god. His seemingly never-ending wars of expansion had also begun to wear on some of his generals. So it is possible that Ptolemy was part of a larger conspiracy to dispose of Alexander and divide his empire. Then what happened with Alexander's body after his death also raises some questions. His body was to be transported from Babylon, where he died, to Pella, the place of his birth in the Macedonian capital. It would be the first time Alexander had returned home in 13 years since starting his campaign against the Persians. However, on the trip home, Ptolemy had captured the body, having it first entombed in the ancient Egyptian capital of Memphis. Then, later, moved and entombed in Alexandria. Now, his tomb was visible at least at the time of Julius Caesar, and we know this because historic sources tell us that Julius Caesar visited Alexander's tomb. However, the location of Alexander's tomb has since been lost to history. Now, for his empire, in the wake of his death, his empire would be carved up. Ptolemy would end up ruling Egypt, establishing a dynasty that would last until Cleopatra VII. Yes, this time we are talking about that Cleopatra, like Julius Caesar, Mark Antony, etc. That dynasty would last until 30 BCE. Macedonia would find itself in a series of wars of secession. Both Alexander's mother, Olympias, and his stepmother, Cleopatra, again, Philip's seventh wife, not Alexander's sister or the famous one that lived in Egypt, both played a major role in these wars of secession. His mother and her supporters fought to place Alexander's son on the throne, Alexander IV, while supporters of Cleopatra fought to place her son, Philip III, on the throne. Now, Philip did come to power after the death of Alexander. However, Olympias was able to raise an army and invade Macedonia. And it turned out that a great many Macedonian soldiers refused to take up arms against the mother of Alexander the Great. So Alexander had such loyalty that even after his death, his soldiers refused to raise their weapons against an army led by his mother. Now, this must have caused Philip III to just freak out. Imagine him storming around the palace. What do you mean my army won't fight? In any case, this would allow Alexander's son to come to power. But in reality, him still being a relatively small boy, power would be in the hands of his regents, including Olympias, his grandmother, and her family. Then, in 317 BCE, fearing Philip III to be a danger, Olympias had him assassinated. Alexander himself, Alexander IV that is, was himself assassinated in 310 BCE by a rival looking to take the throne for himself. Olympias, for her part, was killed by friends of the various people she had killed in her quest for power. According to sources, her body was refused burial by the new emperor. Alexander's empire was then divided into separate independent states ruled by his former generals. In the end, Alexander had spread Hellenistic culture from the Mediterranean to the plains of India, leaving a lasting impact on societies across the region, and leaving us a 2,300-year-old whodunit. I'd like to give a nod to the sources used here, especially Alexander the Great by Paul Cartledge, and of course, Encyclopedia Britannica, where I was able to gather a few more tidbits of information. So please join me next time on Criminalist History when we take a look at The Princess in the Tower and one of England's greatest villains, or maybe not, Richard III.